quite an impact in both directions. On the supply side, as Richard mentioned, we've seen drought and climate change. Now, of course, we can't say any particular climatic event is clearly a function of climate change, but the build-up of warming, of drying that we've seen over probably 2 decades, but certainly one, seems to us to be very strong evidence of climate change and something we have to work at over the longer term. Oil prices were an important factor this time around for a couple of reasons. One is that oil is an input into agriculture, sometimes in terms of more sophisticated Western farming, but in terms of fertilisers, pesticides, just getting food transported around, all that is influenced by oil prices. And then it's had the indirect effect as well on biofuels. Now, biofuels seemed like such a good idea, and it's galling from an economist's point of view, and something that seems like a good idea, because economics isn't common sense, but something that seems like common sense and seems like the right thing to do turns out to be a truly two-edged sword. And biofuels is really an example of that. The idea of growing a crop to provide energy for cars and trucks and so on has a lot of appeal, but the downside, as we've seen in this iteration of it anyway, is that it's taken a lot of land out of production of food. It's also forced up other food prices as people substitute from increasingly expensive corn, which is used a lot in the US to produce ethanol to thin out their petrol. People have had to move away from this more expensive corn. What have they done? Well, they've tried to buy more wheat and rice, and that's put up the price as well. And a sort of a middle of the road estimate, by no means the highest, but one estimate was that ethanol has probably accounted for about 40% of the rise in food prices between 2000 and 2007, but also about 20% of the increase in wheat and rice prices over that period as well. So it's really had a fairly undesirable effect, and it has contributed quite a lot to the food crisis. Now, that's not to say that biofuels don't have a role. If we can find feedstocks that don't use a lot of energy to turn them into fuel, that can grow on land that's not suitable for crops. People are even looking at algae growing in salty and fairly polluted water as a possible source, but that's down the track. But where it is at the moment, particularly when farmers are highly subsidised to produce this ethanol, where it is at the moment, it has a lot of downsides for the poorest in the world. Some countries imposed export restrictions. That, once again, seems like a common sense thing to do. If you're short of food at home, or you think you will be, stop selling the food that you've got overseas. The problem is that people at the very bottom of the pyramid who have to import their food and pay world prices for it suffer from this policy, because if you're putting less food onto the world market that's available for the poorest food importers, they pay more, and that's certainly what was the case. In fact, it was very interesting when India put export bans on rice. You could actually see the impact it had on world rice prices within the next couple of days following the announcement of that decision. So it had a very direct effect. Declining agricultural productivity, we're still getting agricultural productivity growing, but it's been slowing and it's getting below the rate of population increase. We had a huge boost in productivity, the so-called Green Revolution beginning in the late 1960s, which was the result of a lot of R&D in agriculture. We benefited from that for a long period of time. It doesn't last forever, and I think the critics of the Green Revolution who say, oh, it was very heavily dependent on fertiliser inputs and so on, being a bit harsh. If we got 20 years of extraordinary increases in food production as a result of it, we weren't doing too badly. But one of the problems of it was that it helped keep food prices down. And it really acted as a disincentive, coupled with overproduction in Europe. It acted as a major disincentive for people to expand food production and to do more research and development in food. The real shock of the food crisis was how prices could rise. We'd got used to 20 years plus of falling food prices, and in Australia, of course, we're always told, oh, look, you couldn't be much worse off than being a wheat exporter, you know, because you're always going to face a falling price for your product. Then suddenly things turned around dramatically, and part of that has really been a big drop-off by governments in the developed and the developing world in terms of spending on R&D, and particularly the application of that technology to improve output, and we have to do a lot more there. And then world grain stocks were very low, below 60 days, which is a sort of a line in the sand, whereas if you get below that level, there's a lot of expectation that prices will rise. So a lot of factors all coming together. I've been a bit long-winded on that, but I think it's worth filling out the detail. Well, some reasonably good news I have for you. The 2008-2009 series is taking some of the heat out of the crisis. It's been a good year. We've seen quite a big increase in cereals production, and it looks like it's happening in both the developed and the developing world. And there was a record wheat harvest in 2008, and 2009, although it's very early days, is shaping up to be reasonably well, although with some caveats. So we did get the supply response, and economics really hangs out for these sorts of things, because if prices rise and supply doesn't respond to that, economics really starts to look a bit threadbare. But fortunately, prices rose, and it acted as that trigger to encourage people to grow more, and they did. So that's a positive. And also, we've seen that show up in better stocks of grains around the world. So it looks like they'll be up about 16% or 70 million tonnes, so we'll be getting back up over that 60-day line in the sand, and that will take some of the volatility out of food prices. So we're a little bit more comfortable. We've got a somewhat better global buffer in terms of food. But there's plenty of downside. This is the food crisis in pictures, showing you the world price of a bundle of different types of food in the top left-hand corner, and then rice, wheat and maize. And particularly rice, which was dramatic with it more than trebling. But all of those staple crops went up dramatically from late 2006 through 2007, and with a very sharp burst in the first part of 2008. They've come down, and that's encouraging. Prices have come down, although they have kicked up a little bit in January. The February data wasn't available as of today. But they're still, as Richard pointed out, well above the levels they were a couple of years ago. And one thing that's not mentioned very much, but I think is an important point, is that a lot of the countries in Africa, in particular, that have to import food, their currencies have fallen. So in fact, they're not getting a full benefit of these US dollar falls in prices because their currency doesn't buy as much. So that's been an offset. So they're still struggling. Food is still expensive for a lot of countries.